The world is changing faster than ever before. In the past 10 years, there has been an exponential technological evolution, the kind of technology that has revolutionized the world of work as we know it.
The Lawyers Hub was founded on the principle that law needs to interact more with technology, and that greatly affects tech policy as well as access to justice. So the Lawyers Hub exists as a confluence between law and technology, working on tech policy, on emerging technologies, as well as increasing and upskilling the knowledge of lawyers in the area of technology. We support tech startups as well to ensure that the tech ecosystem also engages in policy, but as well understand the issues around data protection, issues that also concern their structure, as well as intellectual property.
If you look at the evolution of technology, it's been relegated as an alternative in most systems. But the realization that 21st century has brought us into is that technology has to be an integral part of our day-to-day systems. And if you look at some critical technology areas like artificial intelligence, blockchain, nanotechnology, biotechnology, then it gives us a strong indication that if we do not start having discussions on the use of these technology areas, as far as law is concerned, then we may be in some kind of trouble. So Lawyers Hub is leading the debate on the use of these technologies, especially in Africa.
Over the years, the Lawyers Hub has supported the innovation ecosystem, convened events such as the Africa Law Tech Festival and the Global Legal Hackathon. The Lawyers Hub has also supported government innovations within the justice sector, as well as trained government institutions and more than 10,000 lawyers across Africa on emerging tech policy.
Our dream at the Lawyers Hub is to have open access to law. We envision a continent where there is access to justice through leveraging technology and with a crowd of enlightened lawyers. We see a continent that also protects its own through better tech policies, that emerging technologies, through its regulation, will offer better value and consumer protection for the people within Kenya and within the African continent. We envision that we will convene policy makers, regulators, as well as lawyers who are more enlightened on emerging technologies and with better digital skills. And we invite you to be a part of this great vision for Kenya and for Africa. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Linda Bonyo. I am the founder of the Lawyers Hub, and I'll be moderating today. I have incredible guests with me to discuss the South African Artificial Intelligence National Policy. And thank you, everyone who signed up for this call. We are really grateful to have your presence today. As usual, we will get to it because we have 1 hour and sometimes 15 minutes. We say the 15 is silent, but we hope we can only take 1 hour as we discuss these issues. It's never enough. We envision an Africa that speaks to each other and that has policy that ideally raises up the continent. So introduce yourself on the chat. Please put in your LinkedIn, profile. We'll be happy to follow you. Follow Lawyers Hub Africa, and we hope that we can connect and continue to discuss pertinent issues. And so at this point, we want to go to a very quick overview on Google Slides for you to be able to form a foundation. Today, it's only 10 slides and we're done. And then I'll invite my panelists to react and to bring in new issues or what they see as, pertinent issues with this particular national strategy. And so I will begin and I will try and take the shortest time. So the policy opens up with formal definitions on what the definition of artificial intelligence is, what machine learning is, as well as what deep learning is in this particular context. So I hope that my panelists will also talk about these definitions and if they are adequate. We'll also talk about the institutional architecture on which are these institutions that have been introduced within the national policy. So we have a National AI Commission or Office that's been created as a coordination nerve. You have an ethics board, and you also have an AI regulatory authority looking at compliance and audits and certifications. Then we have the AI Ombudsman's Office that will look at redress citizen redress in this sense. Then an introduction of an AI insurance super fund around compensation for AI harms. Within the same strategy is a National AI Safety Institute and an integrated AI monitoring center. But also existing bodies have also been repositioned to be able to work around artificial intelligence. So for example, the information regulator on POPIA enforcement extended to artificial intelligence, and as well as the competition authority in looking at what digital market fairness in an AI economy looks like. Next. Then there are 4 funds or financial vehicles that have been introduced within the national, AI policy for the draft AI policy for South Africa. We have the AI Innovation Fund, which will ideally offer these tax breaks. We must say that it mirrors Canada's sort of regime as well. And I'm curious to hear about the role of Canada in South Africa. Kenya's national strategy was very close to Germany and GIZ support. We had Zimbabwe with UNESCO. And so we want to see whether these things come into play as we talk about AI governance in South Africa. Then AI research grants, as well as an AI insurance super fund, which compensates individuals harmed by AI decisions. And then we have seed VC co-investments, which ideally has been referenced. They reference Rwanda, but we don't see whether it's replicated or not. Next. Then we have certifications. And I read this and I said, we need to go back to school because it's only people with papers that are going to make it in South Africa. One is on high-risk systems. Does the SA national policy describe high-risk systems? Is it mirroring the EU system in this sense? So we are going to talk about that. Also on privacy impact assessments that are required, human rights impact assessment, as well as bias and fairness audits that's introduces. And I must mention that credit scoring, healthcare, and justice need high-stakes certification. And there's going to be regulatory impact assessment. Then we compared what this looks like between SADC, the Southern African countries, East African community, as well as the EU. So, of course, the EU, you have, these 4 tiers on the risk tiers on what's actually high risk. What are the fines? So we're looking at revenue-based fines in this sense. And what is the full application? How long does it take to actually apply this? So with the EU, we have full application coming this August in 2026. And then we have the East African community, which we compare it to, that has been really active lately on artificial intelligence with Rwanda, positioning itself as an Africa's AI lab. You have Ethiopia that has established an AI institute and university, and then Uganda, a task force. There's no formal documentation at all. With Kenya, there's a strategy. So we're looking at SADC. Just recently, we discussed Zimbabwe's strategy that was done last month. And then we have Zambia and Namibia, which now has a bill, I believe, in Parliament. And then Mauritius as well, that has a national strategy. So how does this national strategy, national policy in South Africa affect big tech companies? So we're looking at local accountability for foreign AI, and we compared it to also Kenya in terms of employment. They're keen on building their own talent. Kenya's AI strategy looks at how do we have more foreigners and give them visas for them to actually come in and help with the AI implementation. Then we're also seeing obligations around watermarking and intellectual property. IP is coming up a lot, especially for musicians. We've seen this with copyright acts in Uganda and Kenya. And also equitable wages for digital labor around artificial intelligence. The opportunities that we talk about do not be distracted by my background. Opportunities that we talked about, especially what Cassava is doing in Africa and how that compares and who are the major big tech players in the continent. So are we losing what we actually own? Are we incentivizing startups? Next. So civil society, how does this affect you? The AI Ombudsman's office, we've seen being crucial, especially, for example, Kenya, the insurance super fund and the human rights impact assessment. This is the first strategy that I've seen that has talked about child protection provisions, which is talks about manipulative AI for children, predatory advertising, and gamified exploitation of children. It also talks about deepfake and defamatory AI and links it to the Cybercrime Act. So that's useful to know. So let's go to the next incentives around startups and MSMEs. It introduces AI accelerators, which mirrors Singapore's model, talks about equity-free funding, mentorship, and access to investor networks. It also talks about regulatory sandboxes that we've talked about, how to pilot AI innovations, and also an AI innovation fund and procurement exemptions that ideally government can procure directly from the youth, women-led, and social enterprises to bypass these standard tenders that we see. But, startups still don't have, a fund yet very specific to it. There's no compute credits that's introduced here. And then also the general purpose AI track is deferred to year 3 in terms of investments. So let's go to Ubuntu. The national strategy is very clear on embedding Ubuntu. But I listened to this podcast by Vukosi Marivate, who's a friend of the Lawyers Hub and sits on the UN board. And they talked about, we mentioned Ubuntu, but do we really mean Ubuntu? And the draft strategy talks about human dignity, interdependence, shared well-being, and 12 languages. So what's Ubuntu AI in the sense? Does it really make sense? Or do we just mention it in passing? So it's useful for us to talk about it. And, in the podcast, they talk about, extractive big tech and algorithmic sovereignty, not just talking about data privacy. So let's go to the crux of the matter and see what are the timelines and milestones. How do you move from this policy to strategy? So they recommend this 10th of April, you have draft policy published, a 60-day public comment, and you have the ministers signing it off. Year 1, you're going to have the deadline for this comment on 10th of June. Make your submissions to AI policy at dcdt.gov.za. So they're expecting a lot of submissions. And I'm grateful that they referenced the submissions that were made during the national framework, because a lot of countries ignore that. Even when people have submitted, they don't refer to that. I think that was a really useful thing to do. And then the build phase is to finalize the AI policy in 2026 and 2027, and then have, the AI policy guidelines and institutional framework and design the funding approach. Full implementation is year 3, where sectoral AI strategies will be adopted and high-risk regulatory requirements will be in force. Then the policy review cycle begins. The strategy says every 3 years, this national policy will be reviewed. If not, if there's anything that is disruptive, it will then be reviewed earlier. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us, for this discussion. This is what the strategy looks like. A rundown, we like to argue from a point of knowledge, and that's why we begin that. And so I would like to introduce my panelists who will take us through, different discussions on what this AI strategy means. I will introduce them one by one, and you will forgive me as I just open up my tab. It's a good time to post your LinkedIn or your website and talk about the work that you're doing in Africa around artificial intelligence. And so joining me today, I would like to introduce my first speaker. I'm going to be joined by 5 speakers, and I will begin with mentioning that Frank Elianya is joining us from Tech Cabal. We have Dr. Andrew Renz joining us from Research ICT Africa, and we have Danje Seibahagen. Please forgive if I mention it wrong, from Clover SA Limited. And then we have Professor Alison Gilward, who's a professor of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. And last but not least, we have Mindy Mashologu, who's joining us from the ministry. So I would like to introduce Mlindi Mashologu. He's the Deputy Director General for Digital Society and Economy at the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies. He's bringing in 28 years of ICT engineering work, both in South Africa and across the continent. He holds a degree in telecoms from University of Kenyan say Witwatersrand, but you say WITS, and an MBA from the Nelson Mandela University. So, Director General, Deputy, you're welcome. You have a few minutes to let us know what exactly about the strategy stands out for you. How should South Africans and the entire African region, engage around this particular strategy? Do you see, hopes to change it, make it better? Or where is the nexus between what's actually happening and what South Africa is doing?
No, thank you. Thank you, Linda. Good morning, everybody who's on the call, and good afternoon to those who are on the later time zones. I think on my side, I just want to say that because I've been part of, the development of this policy. So I talk as part of the people that have been working on this policy. So the important thing that I just want to highlight on us is that we are trying to live in an environment whereby we don't live in a vacuum when it comes to AI, because we see that AI is a driver for economic development, but if it can be left unregulated, it may actually produce more harms than actually produce the good. So what we're trying to do on the policy, we're trying to set a middle ground to say that what can be done so that AI can drive the economic development, but also what can be done to make sure that it doesn't become it doesn't cause harm to the human beings. That's why you see that, we set up some institutions as part of, setting up this policy. And I mean, if you were to look on the pillars of the policy, we look on various aspects like your capacity and talent development, because we see that as a continent in South Africa, we have to make sure that if we have to be competitive when it comes to AI, we need to make sure that we do have, the capacity to develop our own solutions, which means that from the human resources point of view, but also on the compute, as well as the the connectivity infrastructure, we need to make sure that those aspects are there. But also I just want to highlight also the issues of bias, which are at the core of this policy. What we're trying to do is to make sure that we eliminate bias by making sure that we're saying that all the AI systems that are developed in the country or that are used in the country, they need to use data sets that are inclusive, that take care of everybody that is in the country, all demographics. Because I mean, if you take a decision, looking at me, staying in Johannesburg, it can be a completely different decision by someone who's actually living in the rural areas of South Africa. So we need to make sure that those biases they are eliminated. So there are some of the things that we advocate. But I want to also talk about the institutional arrangements. Not all these institutions are going to be new institutions. Some of them we will work with the existing institutions. Like for instance, if we were to look on the ethics board, currently now you look on various sectors in the economy. Like if you look on the legal fraternity in South Africa, you've got a legal practice council, which looks on the various aspects of law and ethics and everything. So we see that these entities can actually now, rather than looking on those core disciplines, also look on the other aspects of the AI as well. Same as the health environment. We do have health practitioners board as well that looks on some of these issues. So we see that we will repurpose some of the existing entities to make sure that they've got AI, but also some, if now there is nothing that is available, then we will try to work in terms of developing these institutions. I think let me end in the interest of time, and also I requested that I can be excused at just after 11:30. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. And we have a few questions. I know you have to leave, and we're so grateful for your time. There's been concerns around how slow this process is. Like South Africa started this, way earlier. What do you say about the pace in which you're doing this? And then, do you think it's really necessary for the new institutions? And we've been comparing this with the UK model, where you just create a coordination mechanism rather than create new institutions. What do you think?
No, I think if you can start on the speed of the process, I think I always complain, to our colleagues in government that the speed of the policy process that we take is normally very long, but it's a straight line process. Alison would know. It's a very straight line process. You can't skip a step. Otherwise, you skip a step, you find that they will say, no, go back. You have not done this. So that's why also what we did was to actually have a framework which actually came with the areas that we wanted to focus on and ask the inputs from the people, so that we don't bring like an 86-page document as it is now, and it's the first time that people see anything that we've been thinking about. But also in terms of these new institutions, that's why I was saying that we might not form as many as the new institutions that are in the policy, but also we might repurpose some of the institutions that are already in place to make sure that at least they can incorporate the field of AI as part of the work that they are doing. So it's some of the things that we would like to get also from the public comments that we request as well, the inputs that we require.
And how does the national policy on data and cloud for South Africa integrate with this AI policy? And that's a question from Zaidi Misiga.
Yes, the cloud and data policy, they work hand in hand with this, because remember, at the foundation of everything that we do on AI, you need data at the core. So these policies, they are working hand in hand. But the cloud and data policy had to come first at that time, because we were looking on the adoption of the cloud technologies. That's why then, the cloud policy actually came earlier than the AI policy, because we saw the adoption of the cloud at the time, and they said that let's respond to that. But also, I think also one of the things that I just want to highlight is that sometimes as policymakers, we are more reactive than to be proactive. Because if we were to look on saying that now there's a new technology that is actually coming up, and we rush to try to put a policy for that technology. And we need to look on more long-range planning in terms of, the policy development as well from a city point of view. Thank you.
Yeah. Director, before you go, I have to ask Professor Allison to ask you a question. I trust her judgment, especially went through drafting the Africa Data Policy Framework together on the same technical committee, and she was leading this process. Professor Allison, what comments would you have for Deputy Director General? You're on mute. You're still on mute. Still on mute. Let me just ask you to unmute. Do you see something there? The gods of presentation. Okay, there you go.
Sorry, am I unmuted? I'm so sorry. My mouse is reading my big screen. I'm so sorry about that. I was just going to say, Melindy's not going to hear anything he hasn't heard before. So I'm going to just say, if I've only got one question, because there's obviously a lot more that I would like to have, we're certainly going to make more inputs, but really strongly welcome the way the department has really embraced this round of comments. And I know it's taken an extraordinarily long time. And I think a lot of that has actually been working it through government, not actually all the civil society consultations, so that it can actually meet all those requirements. But I still think that the time spans are far too long. We just don't have the luxury of those time spans. And so I think we're going to have to look at ways to fast track that, to at least get the main principled framework in place. And I know it's no use saying we need it more quickly, but because the law takes time, and everything, setting up these institutions takes time, but we absolutely have to find a way to fast track it in the current environment. And then I suppose what I hope we can come back to in a bigger discussion, because I think there are a number of things that we called for that have together with Research ICT Africa and civil society partners, Global South partners, looking at this policy very much in the context of the G20. Many of the progressive recommendations in this policy, we were unable to get ministerial declarations on, as countries, floundered around in this very tense geopolitical environment we're in. And I think if we were actually doing the policy now, in the current environment, we see a whole lot of states that were really, reluctant to take strong positions on language like justice and digital public goods and sovereignty and those kinds of things, now all really very actively exercising those in their policy at the moment. So, I would say I suppose the question is to you, Lindy, is, to what degree will we be able to redress some things that are still outstanding? I think there is the horizontal regulation that's been called for. I think there's the constitutional grounding we've called for. But I think there's still resorting to the international frameworks, the OECD and UNESCO frameworks that have driven policy on the continent, that I think many of us have critiqued as not really addressing the fundamental challenges we have on the continent. And I think there's still this deference to ethical and responsible AI, whereas we now have the Constitution foregrounding this. And I don't think we've got to the questions of economic justice and data justice and real championing of local startups and things like that, would need to affect the fundamental reframing of the document. That is really, making sure that data governance is not only about data protection and individualized data protection, but that it's about collective and systemic harms that are happening, but also opportunities. The framework still doesn't enough enable, the better distribution of opportunities that go with these advanced technologies. And that really goes to the questions of economic justice, of actually enabling access for innovators, actually enabling access for local entrepreneurs, creating, stricter limitations. And I think those are absolutely correct. I think the innovations, there's a lot of innovations there, but I think the conflation of ethics and human rights is still an enormous challenge. And I think you don't let the important aspects of ethics function because they can only work in an enforceable environment, and you conflate them with rights, and then often those rights are not actually enforced because one's looking at the ethical frameworks. So I think there's this central tension in the document about aligning itself with international practice and stuff, which we have to do in a globalized economy, in a multilateral environment, but also creating this really bold African vision of what we can be collectively, and enabling our kind of collective sovereignty, our economies of scope and scale and things that this policy aims to do in its preface, in its socio-economic framing, but then in its practice actually looks narrowly at bias and those kinds of things.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alison. So I know we promised you by half past you'll be gone, but please respond to Professor's sentiments.
No, thanks, Linda and Alison. No, I think, Alison, some of the things we tried, from the inputs that we got before, to make sure that we incorporate as much as we can. And that is why now you see that we've got a very long document, we've got an 86-page document. So one of the things that we think that it might actually help us as well in some of these instances is when we start developing, the sector-specific strategies, which will then look on those particular sectors that are highly impacted and make sure that we craft sector-specific regulations. Because if we try to address everything on one document, it becomes really difficult. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that at least we can set a fundamental framework and, where the rules can be set. And then from there on, we can cassette it down to make sure that at least we can have everything, But also in terms of the speed, I need to highlight, Alison, that we are trying, because that's why we said 60 days until June. So what we will try to work around on our side is that from June to July, we make sure that to August, we finish all the internal processes so that the policy, if possible, can be finalized by, say, September, October, still this year, because we would have liked to have the policy finalized by that time. I know that on our timeline on the policy, we said we'll finalize it, but we're catering for, all the internal government processes that we have to take care of. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Deputy Director. And I must say that Kenyans are looking at you and wondering how you have 60 days for, public comment. I remember there was a policy that was released during the Easter. We had 7 days to make comments, and 4 of those days were Easter weekends. Our members of parliament are bonkers. So I want to say there should be a balance between Kenya and South Africa, somewhere in the middle, where people actually have adequate time, but we're also moving quickly to engage. So thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate, and all the best with your appointment. Thanks for joining us today, Deputy Director. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. And so that question that was raised around Ubuntu and what Ubuntu actually means when we still borrow these frameworks from UNESCO and, UNESCO are great partners, but UNESCO, OECD, all these international frameworks, do they really work for Africa? What's our framework and what should we actually do to ensure that, AI works for the continent? Advocate Nandifa says, what is the interface of this strategy and current regulations that's developed around the Procurement Act? I think there was also concern around working in silos. And so to discuss this and more, I'd like to invite Dr. Andrew Renz, who is a scholar of complex interactions of law, knowledge, and innovation. He has a Doctor of Juridical Science, SJD, from Duke University Law School. He was also a fellow at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society. And so I'd like to introduce you, Andrew, to take up this conversation. What do you see come out? What are the concerns that you still have? And which way do we go, as we continue to get views? Dr. Andrew.
Linda, thank you firstly for this opportunity to speak about this interesting draft policy. And then also, it's not going to surprise you if some of what I say echoes what Alison had to say, since Alison founded Research ICT Africa, where I currently work. But I'd like to focus in on three things. The first is the policy does acknowledge this need for economic inclusion, but it misses a trick. The policy acknowledges the need for accountability, transparency, a lack of bias, and it misses a trick. And the policy would like to see innovation happening in South Africa, but it doesn't really grasp the nettle why we haven't seen the kind of startup ecosystem in South Africa historically that we should have. So the trick that it's missing in the first two cases is open source. And I know I'm not the only person saying this. People coming from a very different perspective, like Stafford Macy, who's coming from the startup sector, angel investment, VC investment, has a similar take for very different reasons. So open source enables you to see what's going on as much as you can with a black box of algorithms. Open source lets people test things and see, well, if you tweak this, then do you still get a biased outcome, et cetera, et cetera. And so certain systems, at least, AI systems, should be open source. So government system, if the government system is going to be deciding who gets housing or who gets what healthcare, and we can't open it up and look inside it and test it. Or if a proprietary AI company can suddenly stop providing it, then that's not going to fulfill a public purpose. But open source is also all about economic inclusion. Once you adopt open source models, then you can have local developers. And if one company fails, or if the government no longer wants to maintain a model, none of that's lost. So open source enables a kind of sustainability, a developmental sustainability. All right, now let's talk about the innovation ecosystem. So these are very encouraging things, the idea of a fund, the idea of regulatory sandboxes, these are all great ideas. But we have to look at the reality, and this is perhaps the policy drafters themselves were not given a mandate to look at this. But while they have done a really great job of saying we've got to look at particular industries and what's going on in each industry, and so I think they've done a pretty good job in their mandate, perhaps their mandate's not wide enough, because you won't get innovation while you haven't dealt with the problems of the innovation sector in South Africa right now. And these are threefold. The one is you can't innovate unless you have secure power. So right now, South Africa is enjoying secure power, but it's gone through a long period in which electrical power was a constraint on the economy. And demand will increase again. Number two is South Africa is very highly regulated. I'm a lawyer. Regulation's a good thing, right? They make work for lawyers, but only up to a point. And so companies legislation, then there's broad-based black economic empowerment legislation, then there's layer on layer of regulation, which makes it very difficult to start a new enterprise without doing a lot of paperwork first.
Yeah.
It also is problematic that you struggle to get foreign investment. Why? Because South Africa, uniquely in Africa, has these foreign exchange regulations, which are a barrier to innovation. So I'll give one more anecdote, and then it's time to hear from others. But I have, not in my role at Research ICT Africa, but as a lawyer, I've advised a number of startups that have all left South Africa because of the foreign exchange regulations. So if you don't deal with these broader problems in the innovation ecosystem, then a pro-AI framework is not going to help you. Now, if a regulatory sandbox were to exempt startups from the Forex regs, AI startups from the Forex regs, and maybe give them an opportunity to see what it's like to attract foreign investment without those barriers, then that would be exciting. Thank you. I have way more thoughts, but we need to hear from others.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. I would like to, echo what you've said around open source AI. And Praveen Naidu says, open source is good, but whose software licenses are we using? Africa does not have its own software licenses to protect data ownership in a decentralized way in major platforms like GitHub and GitLab. So we'll talk about this at the very end. But I like the conversation around sovereignty that's coming up a lot within the chat, and to all echo what you were talking about earlier. Let's open source. Let's look for what's uniquely South African, but also the foreign exchanges. I had no idea about that around startups, because startups across Africa really face different challenges in that sense. So I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for that. I'd like to welcome my next speaker, who is going to talk a bit about her background. She's an attorney and manager. Danje Sebihagen, I want to say that I do not know how to pronounce your name. We invite you to introduce yourself again. She works at South Africa's largest dairy company. They provide legal leadership around data privacy, consumer protection, and intellectual property. She contributed to South Africa's national AI strategy through the Trust and Regulation Working Group of the National Advisory Council on Innovation. She's also a full member of the Law Society of African AI Professionals. And so allow me to introduce you, Danje, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Linda, you said my name perfectly. And that's Sebihagen. We have to blame my husband for this surname because it really is something else. So it's my pleasure to be here with you this morning and to discuss something that I genuinely love and have the opportunity to work with on almost a daily basis. This draft policy really has significant legal and regulatory implications. And this shift is towards rights-based, risk-based from a proportionate point of view and a regulatory-led AI governance model, which is going to affect how organizations design, procure, and deploy and govern their AI systems. So from a data and privacy law perspective, it strongly aligns with and reinforces POPI, which is very important. And this policy is exceptionally well-founded in that Section 71 of POPI already existed, the automating decision-making. And this policy now has strengthened those requirements from an explainability, human oversight, and contestability of AI-driven decisions point of view. So in my view, whilst there are some gaps, which we'll discuss a bit later on, there really is a lot of good work that has been put into this policy, a lot of considerations that have been held, that have been taken into account. And we can expect that the POPI compliance aspects will be assessed in a more expansive manner in terms of how AI is involved. It's increased for regulatory attention in terms of the information regulator getting involved in the potential overlap with the future AI-specific authorities. From a NACI perspective, this was also something that was taken into account when drafting the recommendations, because South Africa is very unique in terms of its Protection of Personal Information Act. South Africa doesn't just focus on the protection of individuals like you and me. It also looks at juristic entities as being worthy of protection. So this was definitely a key consideration when drafting and putting this policy out. And I think it's very South African, and it's something that we should be proud of, because we've kept that, affording privacy rights to juristic and individuals. From an intellectual property perspective, the policy explicitly recognizes AI and the related IP as a regulatory priority. The use of copyrighted material to train AI systems, the ownership of AI-generated outputs, and the distinction between lawful data mining and unlawful scraping. While our South African legislation from an IP perspective hasn't yet been amended, this policy definitely allows us and rather signals that there's impending reform on the horizon. So organizations and users developing AI systems face the heightened risk exposure to regarding training, licensing, derivative works, and the ownership of outputs, which I think we're going to have to navigate all very carefully and in a very collaborative fashion.
Right.
From an emerging AI governance perspective, there's this architecture that now has come into play. So the policy does, as you've already alluded to, propose new institutional ecosystems. So the AI Regulatory Authority, the Ethics Board, and these would operate, or it's envisioned that they operate alongside the existing regulators, such as the Information Regulator, ICASA, the Competition Commission. Unfortunately, this is going to make things a little bit more complex, a little bit more multi-regulatory and compliance is how the environment will start to look. And with the expanded audit and oversight and reporting obligations, especially when it comes to high-risk AI systems, based off the EU's policy, we're going to have to navigate this in a very particular manner. Something that I really feel strongly about, though, is...
sorry, I have to cut you short, but you just finish your thought process. Yes. Yeah.
No problem. I wanted to say, practitioners, this is not the end. In fact, this is only the very beginning. We need to start putting in policies, frameworks, consulting with stakeholders within our businesses in order to close the loopholes, because this is a policy that's on the horizon, is going to come into force, and is going to be adapted. But we have to make sure our businesses are fluid enough to deal with the outcomes of this policy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Danje. I appreciate that. And as you're speaking, one of the things that I thought about was, is this really tech neutral? If every time there's a new technology, are we going to have a national quantum association or commission or an ethics board? What do we do with every new technology? Are our laws actually tech neutral in this sense? It will be useful to discuss that at the very end. And Professor Allison, I'd also like for you to really talk about intellectual property across the continent. What do you see tying in with what Dr. Andrew Rents talked about? Startups, like what does a conducive environment look like? I'd also maybe like your comments around big tech and what you see as who's actually going to be burdened by these certifications, so we'll get to that at the end. But I would like to introduce my final speaker, who will give us, an outsider view to this. Frank Elianya, he's a Nigerian technology journalist and policy analyst. He's the head of enterprise and policy desk at Tech Cabal. If you've followed their work, it's been amazing work from them. And he reports around digital regulation, artificial intelligence, the kind of works. And so I want to invite Frank to take the floor and let us know in a few minutes, what do you see as the gap, the opportunity, especially across the African continent? You wrote an incredible article that I read that I thought would be amazing to share here as well. Frank.
All right. Thank you so much for the invite and for being here, talking with these incredible panelists. I think without even just going line by line, what I wrote in my article, what really jumps out at me from that policy is the super fund. And why I say that is because it speaks to the heart of some of the questions that many people have had since AI became a thing, in many places, in households, with parents, with children, and all of that. And it is really about if an AI or if someone is harmed by an AI tool or service, whatever you want to call it, that has to relate with AI, who pays for that? So that argument has been on and on. And when you look at the national AI policies of different countries that are just coming up, you look at Nigeria's AI policy that is still being discussed. You look at Kenya, you look at Angola, you look at Egypt. All of them are trying to just maybe find an answer to that question. But at the end of the day, you don't see anything maybe cogent that sort of addresses that issue, and which is what makes this particular draft very, very interesting. It clearly specifies what happens. It says, look, instead of you sitting down waiting for maybe a big tech company or maybe an NVIDIA or whoever it is that developed that AI tool, or who is using it or who is mining it, to admit that they were wrong or they were at fault. There is a fund that sort of addresses that issue. So once you go out there and once you're able to prove that something's been done and that you've been harmed, this is how much comes to you. But then it also raises some very, very critical questions. I think the number one for me is when I read that session, I'm thinking to myself, it was modeled after the RAF, the South African RAF, and I read that over time there has been lawsuits against RAF where a lot of people are suing to maybe make claims and all that. Now AI has been adopted across every strata, and I started asking myself, if thousands of people start to make claims at the same time, this happened to me, this happened to her or something. You start to ask, how do you sufficiently investigate those cases and be able to apportion certain amounts of money to anyone, And then also I worry about the capacity of the ombuds person. I know it's an office that is going to be created, but what's the capacity of that office? Would it be enough, to address these cases in time for people to get the redress that they want? Also looking from antecedents of how long it's taking for this particular national AI policy to come.
Frank, I'm going to cut you short though. Just do your last thought.
Okay. I think my last point will be it doesn't quite define what harm is. For instance, how do you place a rand on a deepfake? For instance, how much do you pay when something comes from deepfake or from another AI service? So all of that needs to be clarified for this really, to make sense as it should. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Frank. And you raise really great issues on who's going to fund the super fund. It's a nice to have, nice to say, but who funds it? And on the harms that you've talked about, I think Kenya has been the place where there's a lot of digital harms that happening to digital workers. So if you're a digital worker and you're joining us, exactly, content moderation issues, we've had issues with, Ray-Ban lenses from Meta. We've seen what's happening with Summersource and all these tech companies, and they always run to the next place. I think a lot of them ran to Ghana, and Ghana is launching its national AI strategy, I believe, this week. So next Monday, please join us to discuss Ghana's AI strategy. Hopefully they launch it like they say. So every Monday, join us for these discussions at 12 o'clock Nairobi time. And so I'm going to take your questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring you to the floor, and then you can ask the questions. And I will start we've lowered all the hands, so we're going to start again. The chat is amazing. This is why I attend this session live. I want to read the chat. Antonio London was mentioning some really great points around open source AI and what that looks like. I think it's incredible to read through that and see solutions. And Adeboboye talked about inclusion. What does inclusion mean in this sense? How do we include people? And so if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please just lift your digital hand. We will upgrade you to come and speak. Ask a question. I see Melissa Ninsima. Ninsima, please pronounce your name and let us know your question. It's less than 30 seconds. Make it quick.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I've greatly enjoyed the session. My name is Ninsima Melissa, an AI policy policy researcher from Uganda. And my question was basically on open source, because we understand that open source presents opportunities when it comes to accessibility. But then when we go back to the regulation, how do we incorporate regulation that ensures that open source is used for benefit and protecting the public from bad actors? Because as we know, when we make some of these technologies open source, it would not be a good assumption to assume that only good actors are going to have access to these technologies and are going to want to be interested in how they work, especially when we know that the compensation schemes are quite harmful, or the compensation schemes are quite inadequate, I mean, so in that area. So that's just kind of what I was curious about.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Melissa. And Antonio London is here. He's talking about open source. Please proceed, Antonio. Antonio? Feel free to speak. Your mic is on. Okay. I think something went wrong. Any final question? Anybody has a question? We're giving you the floor.
Linda, could I respond quickly to the open source question?
Yes, Alison, please proceed.
Hello.
Thank you so much. I was going to set up some of the liability issues and that's that you were asking about for Andrew, but I did want to respond to the open source question and also to some of the questions around some of the current constraints on technological innovation. Because I think while these are critical mechanisms and the document, because it's a high principle document, is short on some of the mechanisms, I think a lot of people have made those points. And at the moment, they say that there's going to be dealt with in regulations. But I do think there's a problem with everybody's identification, a lot of people's identification of open source as the primary solution to some of the challenges we have around AI development and AI economic opportunity. I think unless we redress the fundamental inequalities that exist there, and I'm talking about at the consumption, production, and all those other levels, we don't actually make the playing field open for open data use. So it's absolutely critical that if you just leave it in this current environment, self-regulatory, ethical, responsible, we all try and do the right thing, and then you make it open source, it simply allows those with current resources to be able to use that. And we've seen that happening at the international level with big tech, where everything is opened up and then they can get more access to data and extract more data. And so I think it's just important that a lot of these technical solutions, and also some of those around the investment points that are being made, of course, foreign direct controls and all of these things do inhibit small businesses, and we need to take a lot of that red tape. But we also need to create an enabling environment, access to data, access to compute, development of our local skills through research and proper budgets and those kinds of things, to develop this more equitable environment for people to perform in. Because currently, by our failures to do that at the continental level, not only at the national level, that vacuum is filled by big tech. So currently our AI policy is being underwritten by big tech in the implementation of the AU strategy. Many of our national policies are actually underwritten by big tech foundations that are supporting the policies that multilateral organizations are doing, also short of funding and reliant on big tech. So just this techno-solutionism, I think it's important mechanisms, but we must be careful not to see them as the solution to the problems of digital inequality, which are the foundational challenges we face here.
Excellent. Thank you, Alison. I will go to Antonio, then I will go to TT and come back to Dr. Andrew. Antonio. Antonio? Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry, yes, we can hear you. Proceed.
My microphone is in. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Dr. Allison, I'd like to second what you said about availability and access to resources around open source is not the end all be all. However, what open source does for the AI tech sector, it allows people to experiment. One of the biggest problems that we'll have, however, is compute, because without compute, AI is useless. And also in our case studies over Giovanna, we look at the core of what AI is, because I like to akin this to the Napster era, when Napster came out and everybody was sharing music, Wild West, and copying people's music and beats and doing art. We're in that same era with AI. So the policies and regulatory holes will come around the data that is used to train these models, because we cannot forget, when we talk about AI is its core machine learning, and machines learn from us.
Right.
This system is not independent. So a big factor, a big player in AI draft policy has to come down to the inputs, the data being used to train the models, and trackable outputs. Because when we give an answer to AI, being able to reference that answer, especially in a legal context, is critical, because there's no difference. And as we speak to lawyers, there's no difference about the application of AI versus the application of your own research. It is akin to the same errors, unless we apply the same principles of research and validation to AI models and tools that we practice as lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer, but that's where AI stands to me. So a big part of AI policy and AI.
Sorry, Antonio, I had to mute you. We have to go on. Titi, thank you so much for your comments, Antonio. We hear you, and compute is important, data is important. Let's have that in the strategy. Titi?
Thank you so much, Linda. Titi Akisami here. I always like to put this, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, as a technology policy one, in working at the core of AI policy development. So a couple of general comments and then specific gaps that I see, and I'll try and make it quick. Plus, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. 30 seconds.
Okay, plus one to Prof. Allison's comments. For the strategy itself, there are key opportunities that I see around the democratized access to infrastructure, the targeted financial incentives, the cultural and linguistic sovereignty, some gaps around data, but the leadership that it's pushing forward in terms of ethical health tech, and I'll speak a bit more about that. And of course, the flexible middle road around regulations that's tried to inbuild. However, there are critical gaps. One, the multi-regulator coordination, and this on top of the fact that it's been proposed to set up relatively new institutions that are going to be trying to find their way in a rapidly evolving, innovating space. And there's the issues around institutional funding and solvency, which is not necessarily solved for. And if you've been working in technology enough, you realize that this is replicated from historical practices, where to Prof's point, there's a significant dependence on external funding to move things forward. We need to rethink that. And of course, there's the skills bottleneck that I continue to see, where a vast majority of the population is ill-equipped to even engage with the most basic of AI at this point. And then you have those who are innovating right at the beginning of things. All right, last thing is the data sovereignty versus the actual reality we have. Yes, there's a ask for a reduction in hardware dependencies, right? And on the software side as well. But we're still very much reliant out of South Africa and the continent on the compute capabilities that currently run more than AI. So an enablement needs to happen.
Thank you, Titi.
Thank you, Linda. Appreciate it.
Comments. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go to, yes, Advocate Nadifa.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you. 30 seconds, yeah.
Yes, that's fine. The president has developed a system in South Africa, starting from basic till higher education. My concern, Prof. Allison, which I raised at our last engagement, is the absence of the technical vocational slant, where the development of the AI capabilities that will lead to digital sovereignty are situated. That's one. It's very, very silent and it's worrisome. The second one, if you look at what happened as a cyber lawyer now, having been part of the cybersecurity and cybercrime development, one of the issues there, we're talking about many structures that are coming to being, and the boundary management, speaking the military language, was a problem. Hence, we have this delay. How the problem on coordination and establishment of many structures is a question of speed of service. Lastly, which I've raised there, the issue now of the procurement. The issue of procurement, my worry is this discussion is outside the discussion we have on development of regulations of procurement, where innovation and technology is. And I'm worried that we are running parallel tracks.
Thank you, Nadifa. Thank you for your comments. And I want to agree with you on the comments that you have made. We'll get to that with the panel. So finally, we'll get the comment from Onoke John Valentine. Please, everybody wants to speak, but we just don't have the time. I wish this was always 2 hours, but it's Monday. There's so many things to go back to. So Onoke, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Valentine Onoke, and I'm an advocate from Uganda. I've noticed a trend with these policies in Africa in that there is no plan for integration into the AI systems. For example, if you notice regulatory technology in developed countries in EU and US, they incorporate the regulatory framework within the system of the technology. An example is KYC. Most times when we sign up online for maybe a financial application, we are requested to submit our ID. We do not know the law behind this. So my only guidance or maybe further line of thinking for these policies is that they should find a way to integrate them into the AI systems. For example, the DMC, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you see websites taken down due to copyright violations. Now, I want to see maybe the South African AI policy being integrated into real-time AI systems, because enforcement of this policy across all sectors is going to be problematic because AI is seeping into very many sectors at the same time.
Thank you, John.
Yes, thank you.
I appreciate your comments. Excellent. So now let's go back to our panel. What are your reactions to this? We said maximum 12:15. So please forgive us for taking the time. But these are pertinent issues that have been raised. Sometimes people speak to themselves, which we do not like in terms of policy. And so we want to come back to you on what do you see as if the government said, tell us 5 key things to change, that people agree is missing in the strategy. What are these 5 things that you could say? It can be 2 that are your priority. I think that will be useful. So we'll go to 2 minutes, 4 minutes across this, because we have 4 minutes left. So I'll go to Alison in 1 minute. What do you see this as possible? And what are your thoughts from what everybody else has said?
Thank you so much, Linda. I thought we were finishing off. That's why I quickly grabbed the open data question. So thank you for the opportunity. I think, I think that some of the big issues that we're going to have to deal with is some of the open-ended questions that have been left there that are actually the mechanisms that we need to be able to move ahead. I think we're going to have to, I think there's fabulous innovation in the institutional arrangements, but I think they need a kind of reality check of what we can actually feasibly manage. I think, questions around the fund, for example, who is liable? Are we responsible? Is South Africa going to be paying for the liability of, big tech when things go wrong? And why should that be carried? So until we've got a kind of integrated, global taxation system and things that can actually allow us to support the kind of harms and opportunities that go with this, a lot of this is unenforceable currently, except for our local players, and then they may be disadvantaged by having to comply when international players who we can't enforce, don't have to comply.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Alison Gilwald. Now we go to Dr. Andrew Rance. Dr. Andrew, what's coming out for you?
Thank you. So first, just to clarify on open source, I was speaking specifically about software licensing. A lot of people have mentioned the idea of data and data licensing. And in fact, 2 of my recommendations are on that. The one is that there's government data, which African, this is true actually across the continent, not just in South Africa, African innovators need. So for example, in South Africa, government gazettes are currently controlled weirdly by the Department of Home Affairs. They also weirdly, and contrary to the Copyright Act, claim there's copyright over those gazettes. But often those gazettes appear in 2 languages. That's superb training data. So let's say there's a gazette in Venda and one in English. Then you can train a Venda AI. And so that's the idea that government can help provide linguistic data to make AIs in African languages. So that's the second data point, is we need to train AIs for African languages. And here, community data licensing, where the big innovation has come out of Kenya, but with Vusi Marakoti's input, let's see an acknowledgement of the need for community data licenses that help to bring benefits back to the community and answer. It's one of the practical answers to Alison's question.
Excellent.
Third, liability. So there's a lot of concern around liability. And one of the issues with liability is the normal standard of negligence seems to kind of evaporate because we say, well, what would a reasonable AI do?
Yeah.
AI is unpredictable. So we need to start looking hard at strict liability, because it doesn't seem to me like the super fund is going to necessarily be able to handle every aspect of liability. And then finally, there's a notion of public AI, which is some AI either performs public functions, even if it's run by private, or it is run by the government. Public AI is going to have higher standards than general commercial AI. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Rance. Appreciate you. Then I go to Danje. What are your final comments on this? Especially for practitioners who are joining in, and it will be useful to look at opportunities. We've been talking about opportunities for people in these strategies. Just don't read it like it's going to harm you. What's the opportunity for you as well? So Danje.
So there is I just want to touch quickly. So whilst the policy doesn't clarify when and how principles will become binding, how obligations will arise, and unfortunately we're going to have to look at this gap or vacuum being filled through litigation or piecemeal reform so that we can undo the uncertainty that exists currently for developers and users of this technology. But there's so many opportunities. I think this is a really good foundation, and I think with the comments that are coming through, this can really be molded into something that is practical for South Africa, but also take note of what's happening in the rest of Africa and make it useful. It's privacy by design. We can do so much good with this foundational policy, and I think it's exciting times. We're now in the beginning of this. We can draft policies and frameworks that speak to exactly what we need to do and get closer to our stakeholders, which I think is vital for this to be a success.
Thank you so much, Danje. And so finally, we go to Frank Elianya from Tech Cabal. Frank.
Yeah, so while I agree that this is one of the, if not the most far-reaching national policy on the continent currently, but I think there's a need for super clarity, because whatever you leave vague, you open up loopholes for this for bad actors to exploit. And also, why you need clarity is that it will give some form of stability, some form of assurance to investors. South Africa especially needs to increase its compute, like has been said by different persons. The country currently has about 61 major data centers, for instance. That needs to be increased, even though it's like 25% of the share on the continent, but that is nowhere compared to what this policy is proposing. So if you're going to have this far-reaching policy, you want investors that come in and they see a clear path to where they want to invest their money and where that money will be returned. So I think that needs to be, or there's a need to go back and look at some of the features of this policy and see how you can tighten it to make it a lot more clearer. Who gets what? If I get to point A, what do I see there? I need to see that on paper, and what next after that point A?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frank. We really appreciate you. And I want to say that it's useful for us to have our homegrown solutions, because we know the problems that Africa is facing, the challenges that we are going through. One of the positives of this strategy is the national policy for South Africa. I'm impressed that you call out foreign tech companies for what they are. People have been dancing around the issue. Kenya has been this, really welcoming to big tech companies, but they're harming us. We need to see ways in which we stop this harm and that we have locally grown solutions. It's important for national security that your startups actually, do well. So let policymakers know that it's important for us to do that. And so my closing remarks today is from Praveen Naido. She's made amazing comments on the chat. So Praveen, I'm giving you the floor to close it like you are wired for this. You are born for this closing. Praveen.
Thank you so much. Pravinia just stepped outside, but I'll speak on his behalf. We were seated next to each other, both making the comments. Thank you for the discussion, and the discussion was wonderful. On the issue of open source, I strongly believe that Africa needs to develop licenses for technology, so that when the technology is developed, whether it's from Kenya, here in South Africa, that technology has got its own license that we have that to help us. For instance, in China, they have a decentralized GitHub platform. It's their own. So whatever is being developed there, they own it. That's number one. Number two is the issue of allow Africans to develop as much as they can. So the policy, before it regulates how AI is used, it must first put the building blocks. Licensing, the issue of how people what technologies are needed. We have so many things that are lacking in order for AI to work that we need in Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Whoever that is, you're not Praveen, but you made a good point. We really appreciate you. We'll continue to ask how you got Praveen's mic, but I want to thank everyone for joining. I'm sorry I wasn't able to read all the chats. There are a lot, and it's a lot to balance. I see Jed joining us from Egypt. People joined us from the Bar Association in Nigeria. Really, a Pan-African conversation, because Africa is home and we must talk to each other. We must look at the trends, because these politicians are working together. We have to work together to make sure that we are putting in the exact policies that we need within the African continent. So having attended this discussion today, I want to urge you to write something this week. Write it on your LinkedIn, tag us, write it to the media, let them know what you think about this policy. Research ICT Africa is also continuing the conversations and hosting conversations on this particular strategy and national policies from Kenya to South Africa to Mauritius. I want to urge you to engage, because you have to engage. These people will engage at whatever level. Finally, I would want to urge you to join us next week, 12, same time. We'll be talking about another strategy. If your intention this year is to grow and to increase your knowledge, this is where you come. It's 1 hour packed with a lot of information, and 15 minutes, the 15 is silent because we just always go overboard. So thanks everyone. We appreciate you. Take the time on the chat, connect with people. We will not close this immediately. We'll give you the time to read the chat and connect on LinkedIn, because this is the networking session. From me and the Lawyers Hub team, who are amazing and have put this together. Thank you so much, Ken and Louisa, for making today's session happen. We really appreciate the work that you do. So from Geneva, bye everyone. I hope you have a lovely week